Family Guy looks like a show where nothing ever really matters. Characters get hit by cars, shot, blown up, and it never seems to stick. Most people watch this and laugh it off as lazy writing. Then, a few former Fox writers pointed out something stranger buried underneath all that chaos. In this video, we break down every Family Guy character who died and came back. Brian Griffin, the death that caused a public meltdown. By late 2013, Family Guy had been on the air for 14 years. Fox had already canceled it once, in 2002, and brought it back 3 years later after fans kept the show alive through DVD sales and reruns. By season 12, Brian Griffin was not just a side character. He was the dog who had been sitting on that living room couch since the very first episode aired in January 1999. Kids who grew up watching the show in middle school were now adults with jobs, and Brian had aged right alongside them, always a little smug, always holding a glass of red wine, always ready with a comment nobody asked for. Brian was different from every other pet on television. He walked on 2 legs when he felt like it. He drove a car. He had written 1 failed novel and kept trying to write another. He dated human women, which every character on the show found strange but never actually stopped him from doing. He argued about politics with Stewie, the baby with the football-shaped head and a British accent, and their friendship was the emotional center that held a very chaotic show together. None of that history came with a warning label. Family Guy had built its whole identity around never taking anything seriously for more than 30 seconds. So when the episode called Life of Brian aired on November 24th, 2013, most people watching had no reason to expect it would be the episode people were still talking about more than a decade later. The episode opens with something unrelated to what eventually happens. Brian and Stewie are running from angry strangers in the woods, the result of an old time travel trip to Jamestown, the earliest English settlement in America. On that trip, Stewie had given a group of Native Americans modern guns just to see what would happen. History changed. The Native Americans defeated the European settlers instead of losing to them, and armed strangers are now hunting Brian and Stewie because of it. To fix things, they need to get back to their own time, but their time machine has been shot up during the chase. Stewie finds a version of himself from a slightly different timeline and borrows that version's machine instead. It works. They fix the past and return to the present. Stewie has had enough though. Every time he and Brian use his time machine, something goes wrong. So he takes it to the junkyard and throws it away for good. While there, he finds something small and ordinary lying around, a street hockey net, and brings it home. This moment barely looks important, and that is the point. The show spends the first half of the episode on a science fiction plot involving colonial history, then quietly slips in the real setup, disguised as 2 friends deciding to play a game outside. Brian and Stewie set up the hockey net in the street. It is a normal afternoon. No music warning viewers something bad is coming. Stewie realizes he forgot his knee pads and goes back inside to grab them, leaving Brian alone with the puck. It is such a small detail. Kids forget their gear before a game all the time. Except this time, those 10 seconds Stewie is gone are the entire reason what happens next is able to happen at all. While Stewie is inside, Brian chases the puck into the road. A car comes around the corner. The driver does not see him in time. The car hits him. Family Guy has shown its characters get hurt in wildly violent ways before, always as a joke, always followed by everyone walking it off like nothing happened. This time, the show does not do that. Brian is badly hurt. Stewie runs outside and finds him lying in the street. The family rushes him to the vet, who cannot save him. Brian dies there, with his family around him, in a scene that plays out with almost none of the show's usual jokes. The rest of the episode deals with what this leaves behind. Stewie is completely broken up about it. The family decides fairly quickly to get a new dog, and this is where Vinny enters, a street dog with an Italian accent voiced by Tony Sirico, an actor best known for playing a mobster on The Sopranos. Vinny is loud, blunt, not interested in books, and about as different from Brian as a replacement dog could be. Peter takes to him almost instantly. Stewie does not. What sets this apart from every other death gag Family Guy had ever done is that the show did not undo it in the same episode, or even the next one. Brian stayed dead. Vinny stuck around, appearing at the Drunken Clam with Peter's friends, settling into the house, becoming, as far as the show was concerned, the new normal. Audiences noticed immediately, and the reaction was bigger than anyone at the network seemed to expect. Within hours of the episode airing on the East Coast, a petition appeared on the website change.org, asking Seth MacFarlane and Fox to bring Brian back. It argued that Brian brought a smart and clever side to the show that no other character really provided. The petition spread fast, picking up thousands of signatures within the first day, eventually climbing past 100,000. A lot of the frustration online came from how fast the show brought in Vinny. Fans felt like the show was rushing to move on from Brian, instead of giving his death the weight it seemed to deserve. Family Guy fans posted their anger, their sadness, and in plenty of cases, genuine confusion about whether the show had actually meant to do this. It did resolve itself, but not right away. 3 episodes passed after Life of Brian before the show gave any hint of walking the decision back. That gap matters because it shows the death was not planned from the start as a quick stunt with an immediate reversal already written. Then, on December 15th, 2013, the Christmas episode aired, called Christmas Guy, and it undid everything. Christmas Guy opens with the Griffin family heading to the mall for their yearly Christmas carnival, only to find it canceled. Lois's father, Carter Pewterschmidt, a wealthy and generally unpleasant man, shut it down because he cannot stand Christmas. Peter decides he is going to personally fix Carter's attitude toward the holiday. While that plays out, Stewie is dealing with something heavier. He still misses Brian. He visits the mall Santa, and instead of asking for a toy, says he wants his best friend back. He says it is their first Christmas without Brian, and nobody has even said his name out loud since he died. Vinny tries pretending to act like Brian to cheer Stewie up. It does not work. Instead, he takes Stewie back to the mall, where Stewie spots a version of himself from earlier in the season, from before Brian's death, buying a gift using a return pad tied to his time machine. Stewie realizes that earlier version of himself still has access to a working time machine, since this moment happens before he destroyed his own machine at the junkyard. If he can get that return pad, he can travel back and stop the accident from happening at all. Vinny convinces the earlier Stewie to hand over his backpack containing the return pad by appealing to his vanity. He brings it to the present-day Stewie, who now has what he needs. Stewie travels back to the moment of the accident and pushes Brian out of the way just in time. Brian survives. Within the logic of the show's own time travel rules, this is a real change to the past, using a device the show had already established many times before. The Stewie who traveled back begins to fade out of existence, since the version of events that created him no longer happened. Before he disappears, Brian thanks him, and the two share a real goodbye, even though the present-day Stewie will never know this occurred. He simply wakes up on Christmas morning with his best friend alive again, with no memory of the sacrifice made on his behalf. Christmas morning arrives, and Brian is alive and well, sitting with the family like nothing had ever happened. Vinny, now unnecessary, says his goodbyes and leaves. Brian gives Stewie a photograph of the two of them with a heartfelt note. Stewie brushes it off with a joke about how creepy Brian has been acting all morning, which is exactly the kind of joke that makes their friendship feel real. Seth MacFarlane later said the choice to kill Brian came from wanting to shake up a show that had been running the same way for over a decade, and to see what the family looked like without him. He admitted the reaction from fans caught the creative team off guard, and that the anger surprised them in a good way, since it proved people still cared deeply about the character. A few things stand out looking back. This was the biggest, most public example of Family Guy breaking its own rule about consequences, keeping a main character dead across multiple episodes, and introducing a real replacement with his own storylines. The way the show fixed it also matters. Instead of hand-waving the death away, it used a plot device already built into its own universe, following rules already laid out earlier in the same episode. This storyline also shows how much power an audience can have over a long-running show. A petition with well over 100,000 signatures, combined with anger across social media, does not force a network to change its plans on its own, but it shows up in interviews and press coverage, becoming part of the story itself. Vinny's time was always going to be short. He did return once more, years later, in a season 15 episode called The Boys in the Band, playing music with a group tied to a character named Olivia. But within the Griffin household, he existed only in the gap Brian's death created. Brian was family, not just to the Griffins on screen, but to people watching at home who had spent over a decade with him. His death and return were not built for a quick joke. It was treated, for at least 3 episodes, as something that actually mattered, something the show let people feel before giving them the relief of getting him back. That rarity is exactly why this story sits at the start of any honest look at Family Guy characters who died and came back. It set a pattern that almost nothing else on this list actually follows. Almost everyone else who dies and comes back on this show gets no such treatment at all. Most of them die in a single scene and are back before the episode is even finished, with nobody in Quahog acknowledging it ever happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That difference becomes very clear the moment the story shifts away from the Griffin family and toward a man who was not even a fictional character to begin with. He was a real actor, playing an exaggerated, unhinged version of himself, and his death came wrapped inside one of the strangest, most ambitious episodes the show ever attempted, a full-length murder mystery where almost the entire supporting cast of Quahog got trapped together in one house for a single deadly night. Section 2. James Woods, killed on screen, revived by Hollywood medicine. Most characters who show up more than once on Family Guy started out as made-up people, given a made-up name and a made-up job somewhere in the fictional town of Quahog. James Woods is different. He is a real actor, known before this show for movies like Once Upon a Time in America, Casino, and Salvador. He also played the villain Hades in the Disney movie Hercules. Family Guy took this real person and turned him into a recurring character, using his real name and having him voice himself, but stretched way past reality into something wild, selfish, and completely unpredictable. This version of James Woods bears almost no resemblance to the actual man beyond his name and his job. He is written as a monster, wrapped in a famous person's body, someone who lies, manipulates, and destroys the lives of anyone who gets close to him, all while keeping his fame and charm intact. Before getting into how he died and came back, it helps to understand why he became such a big part of the show in the first place, since his story spans years and multiple appearances, each one building on the last. His first appearance came in an episode called Peter's Got Woods, which aired in September of 2005. Brian, the family dog, tries to help change the name of a local high school named James Woods Regional High School, since the real James Woods grew up in Rhode Island, the same state where the show is set. Brian wants the school renamed after Martin Luther King Jr. instead, an idea supported by a woman he is interested in dating. Peter, a huge fan of James Woods, dislikes this idea and brings in the real James Woods himself to fight the name change. James Woods shows up and, surprisingly, agrees to the change, coming across as humble and gracious. The people running the meeting are so impressed that they keep the school named after him anyway. Peter and James Woods become close friends, so close that Peter starts spending all his time with him instead of Brian, upsetting Brian deeply. Over time, James Woods becomes possessive, throwing a fit anytime Peter is even a few minutes late to see him. Eventually, Peter and Brian trick him with candy, luring him into a wooden crate, sealing it shut, and shipping him off somewhere far away. That should have been the last anyone saw of him, but James Woods returns in a Season 6 episode from 2008 called Back to the Woods. Furious about being tricked and shipped away, he steals Peter's wallet at a concert, gaining access to his driver's license, social security card, and other paperwork. Using this, he convinces people, including a police officer who personally knows Peter, that he is now legally Peter Griffin. He moves into the Griffin house, takes over Peter's life, and spends huge amounts of money on Peter's credit card while Peter is left with nothing. Brian eventually helps Peter fight back by having him pretend to be James Woods instead, using fake identification. Peter, disguised as James Woods, goes on a talk show and deliberately makes offensive comments to destroy the real James Woods' reputation. It works. Humiliated again, he gets tricked into the same wooden crate and shipped off a second time. He shows up again in a later episode called Brian Griffin's House of Pain, where Brian gets the chance to turn a serious writing project into a television show, only for James Woods and the network to twist it into a silly sitcom against Brian's wishes. By the time James Woods appears in his most important episode, audiences already understood him as loud, selfish, dishonest, and shameless, someone who kept resurfacing in Quahog no matter how many times he got humiliated. That history matters because it explains why the writers eventually made him a major target in one of the most ambitious episodes the show ever attempted. That episode is called And Then There Were Fewer, and it aired as a 1-hour special on September 26, 2010, as the premiere of the show's 9th season. Instead of the usual format of quick jokes and cutaways, the episode tells one long, connected murder mystery story, clearly built as a tribute to old-fashioned mystery books. Most obviously, the famous novel by Agatha Christie, originally called 10 Little Indians, and later titled And Then There Were None. The episode title is a direct play on that book. James Woods invites a large group of people from Quahog to his private mansion on a remote island. The guest list includes Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian, along with Joe, Bonnie, Quagmire, Cleveland, Tom Tucker, Diane Simmons, Dr. Hartman, Mort Goldman, his wife Muriel, Consuela, Herbert, and several others. James Woods explains he has become a born-again Christian and wants to apologize to everyone he has wronged, which, given his history, makes for a very long guest list. Not long after dinner begins, Quagmire's date for the evening, a woman named Stephanie, is accidentally killed by a hidden gun set up as a trap meant for James Woods. A storm knocks down a tree onto the only bridge connecting the mansion to the mainland, trapping everyone with no way to escape or call for help. More people start dying, one after another. In the classic structure of this kind of mystery, Muriel Goldman is stabbed by an unseen attacker, and Derek Wilcox is struck with a trophy. The survivors turn their suspicion back to James Woods, especially once he reappears, insisting he had nothing to do with it. Right as he defends himself, the lights inside the mansion go out. When they come back on, James Woods is dead, stabbed in the back during those brief seconds of darkness. His death plays out as a real, serious part of the mystery, pushing the surviving guests into full panic, since the killer must be someone standing right there among them, and clearly not James Woods, since he is now one of the victims. The mystery eventually gets solved. The person responsible for every death that night is Diane Simmons, the co-anchor of the local news alongside Tom Tucker, a character who had appeared regularly since the show's first episode without any hint of this dark side. Angry about being pushed out of her job once she turned 40 and replaced by a younger anchor, Diane orchestrated the entire plan as revenge against James Woods, who she blamed personally, and Tom Tucker, who she wanted framed. She is stopped before she can kill anyone else, shot by Stewie in the episode's final moments. What makes this episode stand out is how seriously it treated its own deaths. The show confirmed publicly that this was official, permanent canon, meaning these deaths were meant to actually count, unlike so many other Family Guy deaths quietly reversed by the next episode. Muriel Goldman stayed dead. Diane Simmons stayed dead. Derek Wilcox and Stephanie stayed dead. Out of everyone killed that night, only one person eventually returned, and that was James Woods. His return happened roughly a year and a half later in a 10th season episode called Tom Tucker Tucker, The Man and His Dream, aired February 12, 2012. Tom Tucker chases his dream of becoming a serious actor, with Peter helping him land a small guest role on NCIS. The two celebrate in a hotel room when someone bursts through the door uninvited. It is James Woods, alive, healthy, and acting exactly as arrogant as ever. Peter and Tom are stunned, since he had been murdered on that island over a year earlier. James Woods explains that being a famous Hollywood actor comes with access to extremely high-level medical care. Doctors saved his life after the stabbing through an experimental procedure that drained the life force out of a 17-year-old girl and transferred it into his own body, bringing him back using someone else's youth. The show plays this completely straight, poking fun at the idea that celebrities live by different rules than everyone else, even rules involving life and death. This explanation was never meant to be believable science. It works as a joke about how untouchable famous people can seem, someone so far above ordinary consequences that even death becomes something money and status can work around. The show had already built him as someone who never faces lasting consequences, and bringing him back this way fits everything his character represented from the start. James Woods appeared in a handful of additional episodes after his return, causing smaller trouble in Quahog, never again reaching the scale of the murder mystery episode. His story eventually came to a quiet stop for reasons unrelated to the show itself. The real actor became known publicly for controversial personal opinions in later years, and Family Guy has not brought the character back since. A few details stand out looking at this whole arc. James Woods' death was never a throwaway joke. It happened as the emotional peak of one of the most carefully built episodes the show ever made, feeding directly into the panic driving the rest of the plot. The show also made a clear choice by confirming the episode as canon and keeping almost every other death permanent while bringing back only James Woods. Diane Simmons had served her purpose as the villain. Muriel Goldman and Derek Wilcox were side characters, not central enough to justify returning. James Woods, with years of history as a useful recurring troublemaker, got a death that could be explained away with a joke fitting exactly who he already was. This shows a real difference from Brian Griffin's death and return, covered in the section before this one. Brian's death carried real emotional weight, and his return came from the show's own established time travel rules. James Woods' death was serious within the mystery episode, but his return was purely comedic, built around a joke about fame and privilege rather than any emotional payoff. Nobody organized a petition demanding his return the way fans did for Brian. His revival exists purely as a punchline, letting the mystery episode keep its dramatic weight for almost every other victim, while still bringing back a character the writers were not ready to let go. This also shows something about the show's relationship with permanence. And then there were fewer, proved Family Guy could kill characters and actually stick with it, something it rarely does. Muriel Goldman, Diane Simmons, and the others never came back. James Woods' return stands out even more because of this, showing the writers will still make exceptions for characters too useful or entertaining to leave behind for good. His story on the show spans roughly 7 years, starting in 2005 and ending sometime later once real-world controversy closed the door on future appearances. Across that time, he was tricked into a wooden crate twice, stole an entire identity, humiliated himself on national television, was murdered during one dark and stormy night on a private island, and strolled right back into the story a year later, explaining it all away with a joke about being famous enough to get better hospitals than everyone else. That mix of real consequences sitting right next to complete absurdity says a lot about how this show works. It can commit to something serious when it wants to, killing off characters and meaning it, while still leaving room to bring back the ones it is not finished with, using whatever ridiculous explanation fits the joke best. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps helps the channel tremendously. The next character on this list did not get anywhere near the same dramatic treatment. There was no murder mystery, no locked mansion, no long build-up filled with tension and suspects. Just a pair of old-fashioned stage performers, one baby with a gun, and two grown men who somehow found a way to come back from the dead using nothing more than a quick joke about where good people go when they die, and where the ones who liked little boys end up instead. Section 3. Vern and Johnny. Shot dead, reappear from the afterlife. Not every character on Family Guy gets built with a deep backstory or a long personal history. Some characters exist purely to interrupt whatever is happening on screen, show up out of nowhere, do something strange or old-fashioned, and then disappear again without any explanation. Vern and Johnny are two of the clearest examples of this kind of character on the entire show. They are a pair of old-style stage performers, the kind of act you might have seen many decades ago in a traveling show or a small theater, back when this type of entertainment, often called vaudeville, was popular across the country. One of them, Vern, is the performer. He tells jokes, does little bits, and generally tries to entertain whoever happens to be standing nearby. The other, Johnny, sits at a piano and plays music to go along with whatever Vern is doing, always ready to keep the rhythm going no matter how badly things are turning out for his partner. Their whole act follows the exact same pattern nearly every single time they show up. Vern attempts some kind of joke or performance, and it almost always goes wrong in a physical way, often with him literally falling flat on his face in the middle of whatever he was trying to do. Right after this happens, Johnny steps in and picks up the slack, playing his piano as if nothing strange just occurred, smoothing over the awkward silence with music, the same way an old-time piano player might have done during a live show if a performer forgot his lines or missed his mark. This routine became their signature, the thing that made them instantly recognizable the moment they popped up in a scene, usually appearing suddenly in the middle of something completely unrelated, cutting into whatever the main characters were doing before vanishing just as fast. This kind of character fits perfectly into the way Family Guy often builds its humor. The show frequently interrupts its own scenes with random moments that have nothing to do with the actual plot, small jokes or bits that appear out of nowhere purely for a laugh before the story picks back up right where it left off. Vern and Johnny were built to serve exactly that purpose, a kind of comedy insert that could show up in almost any scene, deliver their little bit, and then step aside without needing any kind of setup or explanation. Because of this, they became a fairly common presence in the show during its earlier years, cutting into different episodes here and there, always doing some version of the same joke, always with Vern failing and Johnny playing him off with a tune. Here is where things get interesting, and where the honest history behind these two characters becomes important to understand. According to reporting done after the fact, looking back at why certain characters got written out of the show, it turns out that Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, personally liked Vern and Johnny quite a bit. He seemed to enjoy their old-fashioned style of comedy and the strange, out-of-place energy they brought whenever they interrupted a scene. The audience, however, did not share that same enthusiasm. Viewers reportedly did not respond well to the pair, finding their repeated gag less funny with each appearance, wearing out its welcome faster than MacFarlane himself may have expected. Because of this gap between what the creator personally enjoyed and what the audience actually wanted to keep seeing, the decision was eventually made to kill the characters off entirely, closing the book on their recurring bit for good. Or at least that was the plan at the time. The episode where this happens is called Saving Private Brian, which aired as part of the show's 5th season. This episode centers around a very different main storyline, entirely unrelated to Vern and Johnny themselves. The plot follows Peter and his group of friends trying to save the town of Quahog from a massive new superstore moving in, a business clearly built as a parody of large chain stores like Walmart that often move into small towns and put local shops out of business. Faced with the threat of this store taking over and hurting the town they call home, Peter and his friends decide the only way to stop it is through direct, over-the-top action, which eventually leads to them getting their hands on military equipment, including an actual tank to physically stop the new store from being built. Somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, Vern and Johnny show up, doing what they always do, cutting into the scene with their usual bit, ready to perform for whoever happens to be watching. Except this time, the writers decided their appearance would be their last. Stewie, the baby with the oversized head and a talent for building dangerous weapons, is the one who ends their run for good. He shoots them, killing them both right there on screen, ending their signature routine in the most permanent way a Family Guy character can be dealt with. After doing this, Stewie makes a direct statement to reassure everyone watching that this time it is truly finished. He tells the audience clearly that Vern and Johnny are gone for good, closing the door on any chance of them coming back to interrupt another scene ever again. That kind of statement, a character speaking almost directly to the people watching at home, promising something is permanent, is exactly the kind of moment Family Guy loves to set up, specifically so it can break the promise later. The show has a long history of having characters claim something will never happen again, only to turn around and do the exact opposite within a season or two, treating its own rules as something to be broken purely for the sake of a joke. Vern and Johnny turned out to be a perfect example of this pattern in action. Their return happens in a season 6 episode called Back to the Woods, which aired on February 17th, 2008. This episode focuses mainly on a completely different storyline involving James Woods, the exaggerated version of the real actor who had already appeared on the show multiple times by this point, seeking revenge against Peter after being tricked into a wooden crate and shipped away in an earlier episode. In Back to the Woods, James Woods gets his hands on Peter's stolen wallet, uses it to steal his entire identity, and moves into the Griffin household pretending to be Peter himself, forcing the real Peter to team up with Brian in order to take his life back. Right in the middle of all this identity theft drama, the show cuts away to check in on Vern and Johnny, and this is where their afterlife makes its first clear appearance. The scene shows Vern, now existing as a ghost, still doing his usual routine, still performing the same kind of bit he always did while he was alive, proving that even death has not managed to change who he fundamentally is as a character. He turns directly toward the audience and speaks to them, breaking the show's own internal wall between the fictional world and the people watching at home, addressing them the same casual way he might have addressed a live crowd back when he was still performing on an actual stage. He tells the audience that people probably do not believe in ghosts, delivering this line as part of his usual style of joke, before launching into a little bit of singing and dancing set to piano music, just like old times. The piano music, of course, comes from Johnny, who is shown at this point not as a ghost like Vern, but somewhere much darker. Johnny is shown sitting in hell, playing his piano exactly as he always did, keeping the beat going for his partner even from that particular location. Vern, still speaking directly to the audience, explains to them why exactly Johnny ended up in hell instead of wherever Vern himself is now floating around as a friendly ghost. According to what Vern tells the audience in this moment, Johnny is in hell because of a serious problem with his interest in young boys, a dark and disturbing detail dropped into what otherwise plays as a silly, old-fashioned comedy bit. The show does not spend much time on this detail. It gets delivered quickly, almost as a throwaway line, before the scene cuts away entirely and the main storyline involving James Woods and Peter's stolen identity picks right back up. This particular joke fits into a pattern that shows up more than once across the history of Family Guy, where the show will drop a genuinely dark or uncomfortable detail into the middle of an otherwise light-hearted moment, using the fast pace of the joke and the quick cutaway back to the main plot to keep things from feeling too heavy. Johnny being sent to hell specifically because of behavior involving children is not the kind of thing most shows would bring up in passing during a comedy bit about ghosts, but Family Guy has always been willing to go to places other shows avoid, often using shock as part of the humor itself rather than shying away from uncomfortable subjects. What makes this moment matter for the purposes of tracking characters who died and came back is fairly simple on the surface, but worth breaking down carefully. Both Vern and Johnny were confirmed dead in Saving Private Brian, shot by Stewie in a scene meant to end their recurring joke permanently. Both of them then reappeared in Back to the Woods, existing in some form of afterlife, still performing, still cutting into scenes the exact same way they always had while they were alive. This makes them a clean, clear example of the show killing characters off, promising the audience it was permanent, and then bringing those same characters back anyway, though notably not by reversing their death the way Brian's death eventually got reversed through time travel in a later season. This is actually an important difference worth pointing out clearly. Brian's death, covered earlier, was undone completely. Once Stewie traveled back in time and saved him, Brian was simply alive again, walking around, living his normal life, exactly as if nothing had ever happened to him. Vern and Johnny's situation works differently. Nobody undoes their deaths. Nobody travels back in time to stop Stewie from shooting them. Instead, the show simply shows them continuing to exist after death, doing their usual bit from wherever they ended up, whether that means floating around as a ghost or sitting in hell playing piano. Their return is not a reversal of their death at all. It is proof that even death itself did not manage to stop them from showing up and doing exactly what they always did. This distinction matters because it shows two very different ways Family Guy handles the idea of a character coming back after dying. Some characters, like Brian, get a full reversal, where the death effectively never happened anymore within the show's own timeline, undone through some kind of specific in-universe explanation. Other characters, like Vern and Johnny, simply keep existing in some altered form after death, still able to show up and interact with the living world in small ways, proving that being dead does not necessarily mean being gone for good on this particular show. According to reporting done afterward, looking back at the history of these two characters, Vern and Johnny did not just appear the one time in Back to the Woods after their deaths. They reportedly showed up from beyond the grave a couple more times across later episodes as well, continuing their pattern of cutting into scenes now and then, even though they had officially died years earlier in Saving Private Brian. This shows that the writers never fully closed the door on using these two characters, even after supposedly ending their story for good the first time around. Once they had proven that death did not actually stop them from appearing whenever the writers felt like bringing them back for a quick joke, there was apparently no reason to treat their death as any kind of hard limit going forward. There is something worth thinking about here regarding how small side characters get treated differently from major ones on this show. Vern and Johnny never had names that most casual viewers would remember off the top of their heads. They never had personal storylines, never had families or jobs, or any kind of history beyond their one repeated joke involving a failed performance followed by a recovery on the piano. Because of this, their deaths never created any kind of public reaction, the way Brian's death eventually did. There was no petition asking for their return. There was no news coverage discussing fan anger or emotional attachment. Their death simply happened as part of a joke, ending a bit the audience had apparently grown tired of, and their return happened the exact same way as another joke, this time about ghosts and the afterlife, rather than any kind of meaningful emotional moment for viewers to connect with. This puts Vern and Johnny at almost the complete opposite end of the spectrum compared to Brian Griffin, where Brian's story involved real emotional stakes, a public reaction from fans, and a return built carefully around the show's own established time travel rules. Vern and Johnny's story involves none of that. Their death served as a way to end an audience joke. Their return served served as a way to make another quick joke, and at no point did anyone treat their situation as something worth taking seriously. This actually says something important about how wide the range is on this particular show when it comes to dealing with death. Some deaths get treated as genuinely dramatic moments, worth building an entire episode around. Others get treated as nothing more than the setup for a punchline, with the return working the exact same way. A joke answering a joke, without any kind of emotional weight attached to either side of the story. It is also worth remembering that Stewie himself is the one responsible for both ending their story and, indirectly, for bringing them right back into it. Stewie is the character who shoots them dead in Saving Private Ryan, and Stewie is also the one who makes the confident promise to the audience that they are gone for good, a promise that turns out to be completely wrong by the time Back to the Woods rolls around barely a year later. This fits a larger pattern involving Stewie across the entire show, where his confident statements and grand plans have a long history of falling apart or getting reversed almost immediately. Whether that involves his repeated failed attempts at world domination, his repeated failed attempts to kill his own mother, or, in this case, his confident promise that two minor characters would never bother anyone again. Looking back across everything covered in this section, the story of Vern and Johnny stands as a clear, simple example of Family Guy treating its own promises about permanent death as something flexible rather than fixed. A character can die on screen, get a direct, confident statement from another character confirming that death is final and permanent, and still return within roughly a year, existing in whatever strange form of afterlife the writers decide fits the joke best at the time. Unlike Brian's carefully built emotional storyline, Vern and Johnny's death and return exist purely as comedy, a joke about an unpopular recurring bit that gets closed out with one punchline and reopened later with another. Family Guy has never been shy about killing characters purely because the audience stopped finding them funny. Vern and Johnny prove that even after making that kind of decision, and even after having a character stand there and directly promise the audience the door is shut for good, the show is still perfectly willing to open that door right back up the moment a new joke idea comes along that happens to need two familiar faces from beyond the grave. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every character on this show gets brought back through a quiet ghost story tucked into the middle of an unrelated plot, though. Some characters have been dying and coming back so many times in so many different, violent ways that keeping an accurate count has become genuinely difficult, and the fighting between one particular character and Peter Griffin has been going on for so long that it eventually needed its own kind of ending entirely, one that finally seemed to stick for real after more than 2 decades of coming back from things that should have killed anyone or anything for good. Section 4. Ernie the Giant Chicken. Killed dozens of times across 23 seasons. Most fights on Family Guy last a few seconds and end with a joke. Peter gets hit by a car, or falls down some stairs, or gets punched by someone he made angry, and the scene moves on almost right away. The fight between Peter Griffin and a giant chicken named Ernie never worked that way. From the very beginning, these fights were built to be long, loud, and completely over the top, running for minutes at a time, tearing through streets, buildings, and entire sections of the town of Quahog before finally coming to an end. No other running joke on the show has lasted as long, escalated as much, or ended in as many different violent ways as this one did. The whole feud started over something almost embarrassingly small. According to the show's own explanation, Ernie once gave Peter a coupon. When Peter later tried to use it, he found out the coupon had already expired. This tiny, everyday kind of annoyance, the sort of thing anyone might grumble about for a few seconds and then forget, somehow turned into one of the most destructive, longest-running conflicts in the show's entire history. The first time this fight actually broke out on screen came during a Season 2 episode called Da Boom, which originally aired in the year 2000. That first fight set the pattern every single one of them would follow going forward. with Peter and Ernie tearing into each other in a battle that seemed to go on forever, causing damage to everything and everyone around them. The format became something fans could recognize instantly. Ernie would show up out of nowhere, usually interrupting whatever normal scene was happening at the time, and the fight would begin without warning. These fights lasted far longer than any normal joke on the show, often running for several minutes straight, cutting away from the main story entirely to focus completely on Peter and Ernie beating each other through walls, across rooftops, and down city streets. The two of them threw each other through windows, crashed through buildings, and left a trail of destroyed property and injured background characters in their wake every single time. Bystanders in Quahog regularly ended up hurt or killed simply for being in the wrong place when one of these fights broke out, treated as an almost expected side effect of Peter and Ernie deciding to go at it again. Each fight almost always ended the exact same way. Peter would win, leaving Ernie looking completely destroyed, broken, or otherwise finished for good. Peter would then walk away, bruised and battered himself, and calmly return to whatever scene the fight had interrupted in the first place, acting as though nothing unusual had just happened. Right after Peter walked off, though, the show would almost always show one final shot of Ernie, appearing completely dead and defeated just moments earlier, suddenly opening his eyes again. This became the signature closing image of nearly every single Ernie fight, a clear signal to the audience that no matter how badly beaten or destroyed Ernie looked in that moment, he was going to be back again eventually, ready for another round the next time the writers decided it was time. Over the many years these fights kept happening, they grew more and more extreme, borrowing ideas and styles from famous action movies to keep things feeling fresh. One particular fight was clearly built to copy the style of martial arts movies, with a moment where Ernie licks blood off himself in a way that directly copies a famous scene from the movie Enter the Dragon. Another fight from later in the show's run borrowed heavily from Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, specifically copying the wild airplane fight scene near the end of that movie, where a hero battles an enemy near a moving aircraft. This particular fight came from the third episode after the show returned to television following one of its cancellations, and it worked as a clear signal to longtime fans that Family Guy was back and ready to deliver the same kind of chaos people remembered from before. As the years went on, these fights also started including small moments that gave Ernie a surprising amount of depth for a character whose entire purpose seemed to be getting into repeated brawls with Peter. One especially memorable fight showed Ernie going through a rough period in his personal life, dealing with his wife leaving him for another rooster, and struggling with a serious case of bird flu that had left him seriously unwell. During this particular encounter, Peter actually had the chance to let Ernie die once and for all, with Ernie clearly in bad shape and unable to properly defend himself. Instead, Peter chose to save his life. Peter delivered a long, surprisingly thoughtful explanation for why he did this, admitting that living with the constant fear of Ernie showing up out of nowhere to attack him had actually become an exciting, meaningful part of his life, something that gave him a strange kind of purpose. Peter also pointed out, in typical selfish fashion, that if Ernie actually died, Peter alone would be blamed for every bit of damage and chaos the two of them had caused across the town over the years, making saving Ernie's life at least partly a matter of protecting his own reputation as well. This moment reveals something important about how the show eventually chose to build this relationship. What started as a simple, repeated joke about two characters beating each other up slowly turned into something with real emotional layers, at least as far as a comedy about a man and a giant chicken can be described that way. Ernie was not just a punching bag brought out whenever the writers needed a quick action scene. He became, in his own strange way, something Peter genuinely needed in his life, a rival who gave him purpose, kept him alert, and provided a kind of dangerous excitement that the rest of his fairly ordinary life could not offer. One especially well-known moment from this long-running feud came from an episode called P-Terminator, where a robotic version of Peter, built as a parody of the killer robot from the Terminator movies, comes across Ernie and settles the matter in the most direct way imaginable, using a shotgun to blow Ernie's head into pieces. For a moment, it seemed like this might finally be the true, unavoidable end for the character, since there did not seem to be any way to survive that kind of injury. True to form, though, the show could not resist keeping the door open. Right after the robot leaves the scene, Ernie's eye is shown slowly opening again, proving that even losing his head in the most literal sense possible was still not enough to keep him down for good. Ernie also showed up in plenty of moments that had nothing to do with fighting Peter at all, appearing here and there across different episodes in smaller background roles. He showed up as a pimp during a segment showing what a Family Guy episode from the 1970s might have looked like. He appeared visiting a museum with his son in an episode involving Donald Trump. He showed up dressed up as another character entirely during an unrelated storyline involving Brian trying to trick Stewie. These smaller appearances helped make Ernie feel like a real, ongoing part of the world of Quahog, not just a character who only existed for the sole purpose of fighting Peter whenever the writers needed an action-packed cutaway scene. For over 2 decades, this pattern held steady. Ernie would show up, fight Peter in some increasingly wild and destructive way, appear completely dead by the end of it, and then quietly prove he was still alive with one final shot before the show moved on to something else entirely. This happened so many times across so many different seasons that longtime fans came to expect it as one of the show's most reliable running jokes, something almost as familiar and comforting in its own chaotic way as any other long-running bit on the series. That familiar pattern finally came to an end during the show's 23rd season in an episode called The Chicken or the Meg. This particular episode took the long-running joke in a direction nobody had really seen coming, shifting the focus away from Peter entirely and putting Meg, Peter's daughter, at the center of the story instead. In this episode, Meg begins dating Ernie's son, a character named Nugget. As the relationship develops, tension builds between Meg and Ernie himself, eventually reaching a serious breaking point. Ernie ends up giving Meg an ultimatum, demanding that she either break things off with his son or turn her back on her own father entirely. Rather than accept either option, Meg makes a different choice altogether. She ends things with Nugget, but not before turning on Ernie in a shockingly violent way, ultimately killing him by cutting off his head in his own front yard. Unlike every single Ernie death that had come before this one, there was no final shot showing his eye slowly reopening. There was no wink to the audience, suggesting he might somehow come back one more time for another round. The scene simply ended with his head completely separated from the rest of his body, shown clearly and without any hint of the usual follow-up joke that had always reassured viewers he would return eventually. This clear change in how the scene was written and shot led plenty of longtime viewers to immediately suspect that this time, the death might actually be permanent, especially since it broke from the usual formula in such a noticeable way. Those suspicions were confirmed directly by the people responsible for making the show. One of the executive producers, a man named Alex Sulkin, spoke publicly about this decision, confirming clearly that Ernie's death in this episode was meant to be final, with no plans to bring the character back in any future episodes. He explained that after so many years and so many increasingly elaborate fight scenes between Peter and Ernie, the writers felt they had already gotten everything they possibly could out of that particular running joke. He specifically mentioned that these fights had grown so extreme and difficult to produce over time that they had become genuinely hard for the production team to keep topping with each new appearance, and that the writers believed they had already achieved the best possible version of that story with everything they they had already done across more than 2 decades of fights. Another executive producer working on the show, Richard Apple, added his own thoughts on why this particular running joke had reached its natural end. He specifically pointed back to an earlier crossover episode where Family Guy and The Simpsons had teamed up, featuring an absolutely massive fight between Peter and Homer Simpson that pulled in characters from both shows at once. According to Appel, once the writers had already produced a fight scene on that scale, it became genuinely difficult to imagine how any future Ernie fight could possibly top what had already been done, making it feel like the right moment to finally let this particular story come to a real, lasting end. This decision puts Ernie the Giant Chicken in a very small and specific group of Family Guy characters. Across the entire history of the show, only a small handful of characters have ever been killed off in a way the writers confirmed publicly as truly permanent, with no plans to ever bring them back under any circumstances. Most other characters who die on this show, even ones who stay dead for a long stretch of time, are never given this kind of clear, direct confirmation from the people actually making the show. Ernie stands out specifically because his ending received this rare kind of official closure, marked clearly both within the episode itself and through statements made afterward by the very people responsible for deciding his fate. Looking back across the full 23 seasons this fight lasted, the numbers involved become almost hard to properly track. Ernie was seemingly killed in nearly every single fight he ever had with Peter, using an enormous range of different methods across the years. He was drowned, he was deep-fried, he was shot directly in the face with a shotgun, he was thrown through buildings and crushed under falling debris more times than could possibly be counted with any real accuracy. Each and every time, without fail, he came back for the next appearance, usually with no explanation offered for how he survived whatever should have obviously killed him the last time. The show never bothered explaining the mechanics behind his survival, because that was never really the point of the joke in the first place. The entire humor of the running gag depended on audiences simply accepting that Ernie could not actually be killed for good, no matter how violently or definitively each individual fight seemed to end. This approach connects to a much larger pattern that runs throughout the entire history of Family Guy, one that becomes clearer and clearer the more of these character deaths get examined closely. The show frequently uses death purely as a tool for comedy, a way to escalate a joke to its most extreme possible point without any real concern for whether that death should actually stick around afterward. Ernie represents perhaps the single clearest example of this pattern taken to its absolute furthest extreme. He died over and over and over again across more than 2 decades of the show's run, and for the vast majority of that time, absolutely nobody watching, including the people actually writing the show, ever expected any of those deaths to actually mean anything permanent. The joke depended entirely on his survival being treated as an unspoken, unquestioned rule of the show's universe, a rule that everyone involved understood without ever needing it explained out loud. What finally changed that rule, interestingly enough, was not another fight with Peter at all. The character who had been trying and failing to permanently finish Ernie off for well over 20 years. It was Meg, a character mostly known throughout the show's history for being ignored, mistreated, and generally overlooked by almost everyone else in her own family. In a strange kind of poetic twist, the character with by far the least amount of power and respect within the entire show ended up being the one who finally managed to do something Peter himself. Despite fighting Ernie in dozens of increasingly wild and violent battles across more than 2 decades, was never able to fully accomplish on his own. This also raises an interesting question about how audiences are meant to feel about a death like this one, especially compared to something like Brian's death covered earlier. Brian's death carried real emotional weight from the very start, treated seriously by the show itself, and reacted to just as seriously by fans watching at home, eventually leading to public petitions and widespread anger before his return finally arrived. arrived. Ernie's death worked in a completely different way. It arrived after such an enormous amount of buildup, spread out across so many prior violent encounters that had never once actually stuck, that audiences had every reason going in to assume this would simply be another temporary defeat, one more entry on an already very long list of times he had supposedly died before quietly coming back for more. The surprise here came specifically from the show finally choosing not to follow its own well-established pattern, breaking a rule it had followed so consistently for so long that breaking it actually became newsworthy enough for entertainment outlets to specifically report on and confirm with the people running the show. Ernie's story, taken as a whole, offers a genuinely useful way of understanding just how flexible the entire idea of death really is across the world of Family Guy. Some characters, like Brian, die once, stay dead for a real, meaningful stretch of time, and then come back through a clear, carefully explained method built directly into the show's own established rules. Other characters, like Vern and Johnny, covered in the previous section, die once and then simply continue to exist afterward in some altered form, still able to interact with the world of the living despite technically being dead. Ernie represents a third distinct category entirely, a character who died constantly and repeatedly across dozens of separate occasions, so many times that keeping an exact count becomes genuinely difficult, before the show finally, deliberately chose to make one final death stick for good, closing out more than 2 decades of history in a single decisive scene. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every recurring death on this show involved this level of drama, sudden bird flu illness, or scenes clearly built to copy famous action movies though. Some characters managed to die and casually reappear, using nothing more dramatic than a wooden baseball bat and a talking pitcher of juice, treated with so little concern by the show itself that hardly anyone watching ever stopped to question how or why he kept showing up again after being beaten to death right there on screen. Section 5. Kool-Aid Man, beaten to death, casually reappears for years. Family Guy has a habit of taking characters from other places entirely, characters who were never created for this show at all, and slipping them into the world of Quahog like they belong there. The Kool-Aid Man is one of the clearest examples of this. He started out decades ago as an advertising character for a drink mix, a giant pitcher shaped like a smiling glass container full of red juice, known mainly for bursting through walls while shouting a single loud phrase. Family Guy took this advertising character and turned him into a recurring background figure in its own universe, using him the exact same way the old commercials did, having him burst through walls at random moments, almost always without any warning, and almost always with no connection to whatever plot happens to be going on at the time. The joke built around him is simple and repeats itself the same way nearly every time he shows up. Someone in a scene says the words, "Oh no," and immediately after, a wall somewhere nearby explodes outward as the Kool-Aid Man comes crashing through it, shouting his catchphrase in celebration, seemingly triggered purely by hearing those 2 specific words spoken out loud. This happens in all kinds of places across the show, showing up in a courtroom, at a party, or in the middle of someone else's serious personal conversation, always breaking through a wall at the exact wrong moment and ruining whatever mood the scene had going before he arrived. One particularly well-known example of this joke happens during the 2-part episode where Stewie is accused of trying to kill his own mother, Lois. During the courtroom scenes in that story, people in the room say the words, "Oh no," more than once, and each time, the Kool-Aid Man bursts through a wall in celebration, interrupting the serious legal proceedings taking place. By the second time this happens, the judge running the trial openly complains about it, pointing out with obvious frustration that this exact same thing has already happened before, and that everyone in the room needs to be more careful about what they say, since apparently the Kool-Aid Man is going to keep showing up every single time someone says those words out loud. This moment shows how well established this joke had already become by that point in the show, familiar enough that the show could joke about the joke itself, having a character inside the story openly acknowledge how predictable and annoying the pattern had gotten. For a long stretch of the show's history, the Kool-Aid Man existed purely as this kind of background gag, a harmless, silly interruption that never really connected to any actual plot or story. That changed during a Season 9 episode called The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair, which aired in 2011. This episode focuses on a storyline involving Stewie, who starts to worry that he has lost his edge as the toughest baby in the neighborhood after failing to properly take revenge on an older kid who insulted him. In an attempt to fix this, Stewie builds a machine designed to boost his own evil side, hoping it will restore his confidence and sharpen his dangerous instincts. Instead of working the way he planned, the machine backfires. Rather than making Stewie himself more evil, it pulls all of his evil energy out of his body entirely and uses it to create an entirely separate clone of himself, one built purely out of every dark, violent impulse Stewie normally keeps at least somewhat in check. This evil clone, sometimes referred to using a version of Stewie's name spelled backward, quickly goes on a serious rampage through the town, causing real, lasting harm to multiple people and animals along the way. He attacks Brian directly, choking him and cutting off part of his tail with a knife. He kills an innocent woman off-screen during his rampage and steals her car afterward. In the middle of all this chaos, the evil clone comes across the Kool-Aid Man, and rather than letting the usual joke play out the normal way, he sets a trap for him instead. Knowing exactly how the Kool-Aid Man always reacts to hearing the words, "Oh no," the evil clone deliberately shouts those words himself, luring the Kool-Aid Man into bursting through a nearby wall directly toward him. The moment he appears, the evil clone attacks him with a wooden baseball bat, beating him until he shatters completely, breaking him apart into pieces on the ground. After finishing this, the evil clone leans down and drinks the red juice that spilled out from the Kool-Aid Man's broken body, treating the entire moment with cold, casual cruelty rather than any kind of dramatic weight. This scene stands out from the character's usual harmless comic role because it treats his death as something genuinely violent, played with real aggression rather than as a light-hearted gag. Compared to how he usually appeared, simply bursting through a wall and shouting happily before disappearing again, this moment shows him getting beaten to death on screen in a way that feels closer to how the show handles a serious villain's rampage than how it usually handles background comedy characters. By the end of the episode, the evil clone is eventually stopped. Stewie and Brian manage to trick him, and Brian ends up shooting him, ending the rampage and restoring things back to something resembling normal in Quahog. Nothing in the episode itself, however, addresses what happened to the Kool-Aid Man specifically. There is no scene showing him getting fixed, no explanation offered for how someone who was violently beaten apart with a baseball bat might somehow still exist afterward. The episode simply moves on from that moment entirely once the main rampage plot wraps up, treating the Kool-Aid Man's death as a small, forgettable detail buried within a much bigger, more serious storyline involving Stewie's dangerous clone. Despite this violent and fairly graphic on-screen death, the Kool-Aid Man kept showing up in later episodes, exactly the same way he always had before, with absolutely no acknowledgement that anything had ever happened to him at all. He appears again in an episode called Valentine's Day in Quahog, shown spending the holiday with his parents, introducing them to a new girlfriend of his, a bottle of a chocolate-flavored drink. He shows up again during the crossover episode where Family Guy meets The Simpsons, appearing briefly in a scene involving a legal dispute between two fictional beer companies from each show. He appears yet again in an episode called Inside Family Guy, shown attending a wrap party for the show itself, treated as just another familiar face among the cast of characters. He even shows up swapping bodies with another character entirely in a different episode. participating in a plot that requires him to be fully alive, active, and completely unaffected by anything that happened to him back during his violent death at the hands of Stewie's evil clone. None of these later appearances ever reference the events of the hand that rocks the wheelchair in any way. No character ever brings up the fact that the Kool-Aid Man was once beaten to death with a baseball bat and had his spilled juice licked up off the ground by a murderous clone. He simply continues appearing exactly as he always had, bursting through walls, celebrating with his usual catchphrase, completely unaffected by what should have been, by any normal storytelling logic, a permanent and clearly documented death. This pattern says something important about how the show treats background characters compared to more central ones. A character like Brian, covered earlier, gets a death that the show treats with real seriousness, staying gone for multiple episodes before eventually receiving a full, carefully explained reversal built around the show's own established time travel rules. A character like James Woods, also covered earlier, gets a death that at least receives an explanation for his return, however ridiculous that explanation happens to be, tying his survival to a joke about fame and wealth. The Kool-Aid Man receives none of this kind of treatment at all. There is no explanation given for his continued existence after his death. There is no scene addressing how he came back. He is simply present again in later episodes, exactly as if nothing had ever happened, treated with a level of disregard that goes even further than most other examples covered so far on this list. This actually makes the Kool-Aid Man one of the clearest possible examples of how loosely Family Guy treats its own sense of continuity, meaning the way events from one episode are expected to connect logically to events shown in a different episode. Many shows try to keep track of what has happened to their characters across different episodes, making sure that if someone dies, that death stays consistent with whatever happens to them afterward. Family Guy openly does not care about this kind of consistency, especially when it comes to characters who exist mainly as background gags rather than fully developed parts of the ongoing story. The Kool-Aid Man's violent death in one episode and his casual, unexplained return in several later ones shows this approach in its purest, most obvious form. His death mattered enough to serve as a disturbing beat within one specific episode's darker storyline, but it never mattered enough to actually change anything about how he got used going forward. There is also something worth noticing about how this particular death happened in the first place, especially compared to a character like Ernie the Giant Chicken, covered in the previous section. Ernie's many deaths always happened directly at the hands of Peter, his one true rival, built up across more than 2 decades of increasingly elaborate fight scenes specifically between the two of them. The Kool-Aid Man's death happened at the hands of a completely different character, one created for a single episode and never seen again afterward once that episode's plot resolved itself. This means the Kool-Aid Man's death carries even less connection to any kind of ongoing rivalry or storyline compared to Ernie's repeated battles with Peter. It exists as a completely isolated, one-time event, tucked into a single episode's darker subplot, disconnected from anything that came before it or anything that came after it. Taken together, everything about the Kool-Aid Man's death and return points toward the same basic truth that keeps showing up across this entire list. Family Guy uses death as a tool that serves whatever specific joke or story a particular episode needs in that moment, without any real concern for whether that choice needs to stay consistent going forward. Sometimes that tool gets used carefully and deliberately, built up with real emotional weight, the way Brian's death was handled. Sometimes it gets used as a punchline, explained away with an absurd, over-the-top justification, the way James Woods' death was handled. And sometimes, as with the Kool-Aid Man, it barely gets acknowledged at all, beyond the single scene where it happens, treated as disposable and forgettable the moment that scene's specific purpose has been served. This particular case also raises an interesting question worth sitting with for a moment. If a character can be beaten to death with a baseball bat in one episode, and then simply reappear in several later ones without a single word of explanation, what does death even really mean within the world this show has built for itself? The honest answer, based on everything covered across this list so far, seems to be that it depends entirely on which specific character it happens to and which specific writer happens to be working on that particular episode at the time. Some deaths get treated as permanent and meaningful. Others get treated as something that barely needs to be mentioned again once the episode ends. The Kool-Aid Man sits firmly in that second group. A character whose death carried just enough weight to serve one specific dark comedy moment, and just little enough lasting importance to be completely ignored every single time he shows up again afterward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every death and return on this list involves quite so much simple disregard, though. The next story on this list involves a character whose disappearance actually got treated as a serious, ongoing mystery within the show itself, stretching out across an entire year of story time, complete with a fake backstory involving amnesia, a rescue at sea, and a courtroom reveal that shocked everyone in Quahog watching it unfold. Section 6. Lois Griffin, presumed dead for a year, alive with amnesia. Lois Griffin had been part of Family Guy since the very first episode aired back in January of 1999. She is the mother of the family, married to Peter, and the daughter of a wealthy man named Carter Pewterschmidt, whose money and status often show up as a running joke throughout the series. Lois usually plays the role of the one somewhat responsible adult in the house, trying to keep some kind of order while everyone else around her makes increasingly ridiculous decisions. She is patient with Peter far beyond what most people would consider reasonable. She tries her best with her 3 children, and she generally comes across as the closest thing the Griffin household has to a normal, grounded presence. Because of this role, nobody watching the show had any real reason to expect Lois would ever be the one placed at the center of a serious, ongoing mystery involving her own supposed death. That changed with a 2-part episode released across 2 separate weeks in November of 2007, made up of an episode called Stewie Kills Lois, which aired first, and a direct follow-up episode called Lois Kills Stewie, which aired the following week. These 2 episodes together marked the 100th and 101st episodes of the entire series, and the show clearly built them to feel like a big, important milestone, something worth celebrating with a storyline bigger and more dramatic than a normal single-episode plot. The story begins with something fairly ordinary. Brian, the family dog, gives Lois a pair of tickets to go on a cruise as a gift. Rather than inviting Brian along with her, since he was the one who gave her the tickets in the first place, Lois decides to invite Peter instead, wanting to spend the time with her husband. This decision upsets Brian, who clearly expected to be included after making the generous gesture himself, though this disappointment mostly plays out as a smaller side detail compared to what happens next. Stewie, the baby of the family, is left out of the trip entirely, purely because he is the youngest, and the family assumes a baby has no business going on a cruise built for adults. Stewie takes this exclusion personally, feeling insulted at being left behind simply because of his age. Brian points out to Stewie that despite his constant talk over the years about wanting to kill his own mother, something Stewie has brought up many times before as an ongoing joke throughout the series, he has never actually gone through with any real attempt to hurt her. Stewie, frustrated at being called out this way and wanting to prove Brian wrong, decides this is finally the moment he is going to follow through on his plan for real. While Peter and Lois are enjoying their vacation out on the ocean, Peter manages to embarrass Lois multiple times in front of other passengers, doing things like accidentally going to the bathroom in a public area of the ship, and openly telling their ship captain a story about how he and Lois once considered ending her pregnancy with their daughter Meg. Furious and humiliated by her husband's behavior, Lois storms off by herself to get away from him, walking out onto the open deck of the ship to cool down and be alone for a while. This is exactly the opportunity Stewie has been waiting for. He has secretly traveled to the cruise ship on his own, using a small speedboat to reach it without anyone in the family realizing what he was planning. Finding Lois alone on the deck, Stewie opens fire on her using a submachine gun, hitting her directly and sending her falling backward off the side of the ship and into the ocean below. As far as anyone watching in that moment can tell, Lois is dead, shot and left in open water far from land with no way to survive. 6 days pass within the story before Joe, one of Peter's close friends who also happens to be a police officer, informs Peter that the official search for Lois has been called off. Despite an extensive effort to locate her, nobody involved in the search is able to find any sign of her, and the authorities eventually conclude there is nothing more they can do. As far as the Griffin family and everyone else in Quahog understands the situation at this point, Lois Griffin is gone for good, lost at sea and presumed dead. What follows across the rest of that first episode and into the beginning of the second one shows the family, and Peter especially, slowly moving on with life without her. Peter starts dating other women again, going out with a wide range of unusual partners over the following months, treated by the show mostly as a series of quick jokes rather than any kind of serious emotional journey. At the same time, in order to protect Chris from the pain of losing his mother, Peter occasionally asks Joe to dress up and pretend to be Lois around the house, a strange and uncomfortable solution meant purely to shield one specific member of the family from processing the loss directly. Throughout this entire stretch, Stewie is the only person who actually knows what really happened to his mother, and he chooses to keep this secret entirely to himself, showing no outward guilt or concern about what he has done. When he eventually reveals to Brian, somewhat indirectly, that he was the one responsible for what happened to Lois, Brian is horrified and deeply disturbed by the revelation, having never actually believed Stewie would follow through on his constant threats. Brian decides he needs to expose Stewie for what he has done, setting up the central conflict that carries the story forward from that point onward. The second episode, Lois Kills Stewie, picks up directly from this point, and this is where the story takes its biggest turn. Lois suddenly reappears back in Quahog, very much alive, walking straight into the middle of everyone's daily life, and immediately announcing to the family that Stewie tried to kill her. Understandably, given that a full year has now passed within the story since she was last seen, everyone around her is confused and skeptical about this sudden reappearance, especially considering how impossible her survival would seem given everything they had already been told about the search efforts that had failed to find her. Lois then explains everything that happened to her during that missing year, and the explanation the show gives is deliberately wild and over the top, fitting perfectly with the kind of humor Family Guy regularly leans on for its more dramatic storylines. According to what Lois tells everyone, after being shot and falling into the ocean, she was rescued by a merman, a mythical sea creature that is part human and part fish, who nursed her back to health following her injuries. During her recovery, Lois found herself suffering from amnesia, a condition where a person loses their memory, meaning she had no idea who she was, where she came from, or what had happened to her family back home. Left to wander on her own with no memory of her past life, Lois eventually made her way to a place called Camp Podowna-Deforka, a fictional weight loss camp for children located in North Carolina, where she found work as a camp counselor. Her job at the camp specifically involved preventing the children there from resorting to eating one another, a joke played for pure absurdity rather than any kind of serious plot point. A few months into working at this camp, Lois met a young man who seemed friendly and kind at first, and the two of them began a relationship together. It was only later that Lois discovered this man was secretly a member of a white supremacist group, someone who held deeply hateful and racist beliefs he had been hiding from her. Lois eventually attended a gathering connected to this group alongside her new boyfriend, and once there, she spoke out publicly against the hateful views being expressed around her. This open confrontation angered one of the people present at the event enough that he threw a bottle directly at her, striking her in the head. Rather than causing any further harm, this specific blow to the head is what somehow restored restored her lost memory all at once, allowing her to suddenly remember exactly who she was, where she came from, and what had happened to her before she lost her memory in the first place. With her memory fully restored, Lois immediately made her way back home to Quahog to reunite with her family and confront Stewie directly about what he had done to her. Once everyone hears this full explanation, Stewie realizes his secret is now completely exposed, with no way left to deny what he had done. He panics and manages to escape from the courthouse where much of this confrontation takes place, evading the police as they search for him throughout the rest of the episode. While on the run, Stewie ties up members of his own family inside their home and forces Brian, at gunpoint, to drive him toward Washington, D.C., revealing along the way that his plans go far beyond simply covering up what he did to his mother. Using disguises and fake identification, Stewie and Brian manage to sneak their way into a heavily secured government building belonging to the Central Intelligence Agency. Once inside, Stewie gains access to a powerful supercomputer system and uses it to seize control of the entire electrical power grid, effectively holding the whole country hostage by threatening to shut off electricity everywhere unless his demands are met. His ultimate demand, consistent with things he has talked about many times throughout the show's history, is to be declared president of the world, with total power over everyone. Government officials attempt to stop him, but find themselves completely helpless against the threat he now poses with this level of control over the country's power supply. Stewie succeeds in broadcasting a message from inside the White House itself, announcing a set of harsh new laws he intends to enforce across the entire planet now that he has seized this level of power. Lois, having already been through so much over the past year, reaches her breaking point upon learning what her son has managed to do, and she confronts him directly, breaking into the Oval Office to stop him herself. What follows is an intense, violent confrontation between Lois and Stewie, both of them armed with a wide variety of weapons as they fight each other directly inside the White House. After a long, drawn-out battle, Lois eventually manages to gain the clear upper hand over her son, preparing to end the fight by shooting him. In this moment, Stewie speaks to her directly, appealing to her feelings as his mother, and Lois ultimately finds herself unable to actually go through with killing her own child, no matter how much damage he has already caused, or how dangerous he has proven himself to be. She lowers her weapon and surrenders to him instead, choosing to spare his life even after everything he had already done to her. Stewie, showing no similar hesitation about hurting his own mother, immediately takes advantage of her surrender and prepares to kill her once she has lowered her guard. Right at this critical moment, Peter suddenly bursts into the room and shoots Stewie directly, first in the chest and then in the head, killing him instantly and ending the standoff before he is able to harm Lois any further. Peter and Lois stand together over Stewie's body afterward, holding each other in complete silence, both of them devastated despite everything Stewie had put them through across the entire ordeal. Right after this heavy, emotional moment, the screen suddenly displays the words "Simulation over," immediately pulling the entire story in a completely different direction. The scene shifts to reveal Stewie sitting inside a strange chair connected to some kind of device, very much alive and completely unharmed. Brian walks into the room carrying postcards that Peter and Lois had apparently sent from their cruise, which is shown to still be going well for them in the actual present timeline of the show. It becomes clear at this point that the entire storyline covered across both of these episodes, everything involving the shooting on the cruise ship, the year spent missing, the merman rescue, the amnesia, the courthouse confrontation, and the final violent battle in the White House, had all taken place entirely inside a computer simulation that Stewie had built for himself. He created this simulation specifically to see how things might play out if he actually tried to kill his mother and then attempted to take over the world, using it as a kind of test run before deciding whether or not he was ready to attempt any of it for real. show. Stewie explains to Brian that based on what he just experienced within the simulation, things clearly did not go the way he would have wanted, and he admits that his plans to actually kill Lois and take over the world are going to have to wait for some other time. Brian, processing everything he has just learned, wonders aloud whether people watching this whole story unfold might feel cheated or annoyed to discover that such a long, dramatic storyline had ultimately just been an elaborate dream sequence built entirely inside Stewie's imagination. Stewie brushes this concern aside, arguing confidently that a proper computer simulation is something completely different from a simple dream, defending the storytelling choice directly to Brian as though speaking on behalf of the writers themselves. Brian pushes back, insisting that people would still likely feel frustrated by this kind of ending regardless of how Stewie chooses to label it. Stewie responds by pointing out that at least this ending did not cut off abruptly in the middle of a sentence, poking fun at the famously controversial and ambiguous ending of the television show The Sopranos, which had ended its own run by cutting suddenly to a black screen right in the middle of a scene. As Stewie finishes making this exact point, the screen abruptly cuts to black in the middle of his own sentence, matching the very thing he was just making fun of only seconds earlier. Looking closely at everything covered across both of these episodes, Lois Griffin technically never actually died in any lasting, meaningful sense at all, since the entire storyline surrounding her supposed death was revealed by the end to have taken place entirely inside a fictional simulation built by Stewie. Within the logic of that simulation itself, however, her story still plays out as one of the most detailed, carefully built death and return storylines the show ever produced, complete with a specific method of death, an extended period where she was genuinely believed to be gone for good, and an elaborate, joke-filled explanation covering exactly how she managed to survive and eventually return home. The show clearly put a great deal of effort into building out every part of this fictional journey, treating the amnesia, the merman rescue, and the strange weight loss camp job with the same level of detailed storytelling it might normally reserve for a storyline meant to be taken as fully real within the show's own established world. This particular storyline also stands apart from most other examples covered so far because of how openly the show admits, right there within the episode itself, that the entire thing was never meant to be treated as something real happening within the actual ongoing world of the show. Brian and Stewie discussing directly whether audiences might feel cheated by this kind of ending shows the writers were fully aware of how unusual and potentially frustrating this storytelling choice might come across. And rather than hiding from that reaction, the show chose to address it head-on, turning the audience's likely frustration into one final joke before the episode even finished. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section on this list turns its attention to Stewie himself, since it turns out he was not the only one facing a fake death buried inside that very same simulation. Right in that same tense final scene inside the White House, before Peter ever burst through the door to save Lois, Stewie experienced a death of his own within that fictional world, shot twice at close range in a moment that, at least for those few seconds before the screen flashed those two important words, looked every bit as final and permanent as what had just happened to his mother throughout the entire year she had supposedly spent missing. Section 7. Stewie Griffin, shot in the chest and head, revealed as a simulation. The previous section covered the elaborate fake death Lois Griffin experienced across the two-part episode event called Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which aired across 2 weeks in November of 2007 as the show's 100th and 101st episodes. That story followed Lois getting shot and presumed dead for a full year, only for the entire thing to be revealed as a computer simulation built by Stewie. What often gets missed when people talk about that storyline is that Lois was not the only character who technically died inside that same simulation. Stewie himself dies too, in the very same scene, only moments before the simulation ends and the truth comes out. To understand this properly, properly, it helps to walk back through the final stretch of Lois kills Stewie one more time. This time, focusing specifically on what happens to Stewie rather than what happens to his mother. By the time the story reaches its final act, Stewie has already been exposed as the person responsible for shooting Lois and leaving her for dead a year earlier. Once his secret comes out in front of the whole family, he panics and runs, escaping capture and dragging Brian along with him at gunpoint. What starts as an attempt to avoid getting caught quickly turns into something much bigger. Stewie forces Brian to drive him toward Washington, D.C., and once there, the two of them use disguises to sneak into a heavily guarded government building belonging to the Central Intelligence Agency. Inside, Stewie gets access to a powerful government computer system, and instead of using it for anything small, he takes control of the entire country's electrical power grid. This gives him the ability to threaten to shut off electricity everywhere, unless the government agrees to his demands. His actual demand is something he has talked about many times across the show's history in one form or another. He wants to be declared president of the world, given complete power over the entire planet. Government officials try to stop him, but with the power grid under his control, there is very little anyone can actually do to fight back. Stewie succeeds in broadcasting his message from inside the White House itself, announcing a set of harsh new rules he plans to enforce across the whole world now that he has this level of power. Lois, who has already survived a shooting, a year lost at sea, amnesia, and a strange life working at a weight loss camp, reaches her limit when she hears what her son has done. She makes her way into the White House herself and confronts Stewie directly in the Oval Office. What follows is a long, intense, physical fight between mother and son, both of them armed and neither one holding back. Eventually, Lois gets the better of him, and she is ready to finish the fight by shooting him. Stewie, sensing this might be the end, appeals directly to her as his mother, and Lois cannot bring herself to actually pull the trigger on her own child, no matter what he has done. She lowers her weapon and surrenders instead. This is where Stewie's own death comes into play. The moment Lois puts her guard down, Stewie shows no hesitation about taking advantage of the situation. He moves to kill her right there, with no mercy of his own to match the mercy she had just shown him. Before he can finish what he started, Peter bursts into the room. He does not hesitate either. Peter shoots Stewie directly, first in the chest and then in the head, killing him on the spot to stop him from harming Lois. For a few seconds, this plays completely straight, exactly like every other serious death the show had shown up to that point. Peter and Lois stand over Stewie's body together, holding each other in silence. There is no joke placed in the middle of this moment, no cutaway gag to break the tension. Given everything the show had already put Lois and the rest of the family through across the previous episode and the first half of this one, a viewer watching for the first time would have every reason to believe this is genuinely how the whole storyline ends, with the family finally forced to deal with what their own son had become, and with Peter taking the drastic step of ending Stewie's life to protect his wife. That belief lasts for only a moment. Right after this scene plays out, the words "simulation over" appear on screen. The picture shifts immediately, pulling away from the tense, emotional moment inside the Oval Office and revealing something completely different. Stewie is shown sitting inside a strange chair-like device, alive, unharmed, and very clearly not dead at all. Brian walks into the room holding postcards that Peter and Lois had sent from their actual cruise trip. The same trip that had started this entire storyline back in the very first episode of the two-parter. According to these postcards, the cruise is going well for them in the real, current timeline of the show. It becomes clear at this point that everything the audience had just watched, stretching across 2 full episodes, had never actually happened within the real, ongoing world of the show at all. The shooting of Lois on the cruise ship, Her years spent missing at sea, her rescue by a merman, her amnesia, her time working at a strange weight loss camp, her eventual return home, Stewie's exposure and escape, his takeover of the country's power grid, his declaration that he wanted to become president of the world, the fight between him and his mother in the Oval Office, and finally, his own death at the hands of his father. Every single piece of that story had taken place entirely inside a computer simulation that Stewie had personally built. The purpose behind building this simulation is explained directly. Stewie created it specifically to test out what might happen if he actually followed through on killing his mother and then attempted to take over the world, using the simulation as a kind of trial run before deciding whether any of it was worth attempting for real. Based on what just played out, including his own death at the end of it, Stewie concludes that this particular plan did not go the way he would have wanted. He tells Brian directly that his ambitions toward killing Lois and ruling the world are going to have to wait for another time, treating the entire dramatic, violent storyline the audience had just watched as nothing more than useful information gathered from a failed test. What makes this moment especially interesting is the conversation that happens right afterward between Brian and Stewie. Brian, clearly processing what he has just learned, wonders out loud whether people watching this whole story unfold might feel cheated or annoyed to find out that such a long, dramatic, high-stakes storyline had actually just been an elaborate simulation happening entirely inside Stewie's own head. This is the show directly acknowledging, through its own characters, that this kind of twist ending carries real risk of frustrating an audience that had just spent 2 full episodes emotionally invested in a story that turns out to have never truly happened. Stewie pushes back against this concern, arguing that a properly built computer simulation is completely different from something like a simple dream, defending the storytelling decision as though he were speaking directly on behalf of the writers who created this entire twist in the first place. Brian is not convinced, insisting that people would likely still feel frustrated by this kind of ending no matter how Stewie chooses to describe or justify it. Stewie responds by pointing out that at least this particular ending did not cut off suddenly in the middle of a sentence, a direct reference to the widely discussed and controversial ending of the television show The Sopranos, which had wrapped up its own long run by abruptly cutting to a black screen in the middle of a scene, leaving many viewers confused and frustrated at the time. Right as Stewie finishes making this exact point, poking fun at that other show's famously abrupt ending, the screen suddenly cuts to black in the middle of his own sentence, mirroring the very thing he had just been mocking only seconds before. Looking at this whole sequence honestly, Stewie's death inside Lois Kills Stewie stands as one of the strangest examples on this entire list, because it raises a genuine question about whether it should even count as a real death and return at all. Unlike Brian, who actually died and actually came back through a real in-universe method involving time travel, and unlike James Woods, who actually died and actually came back through an over-the-top but still real in-universe explanation involving fame and medical treatment, Stewie's death never happened in the first place within the actual ongoing world of the show. It happened entirely inside a simulation of his own creation, a fictional story built by a fictional character, existing purely as one layer removed from the show's real continuity. Despite this, the storyline still earns its place on any honest look at deaths and returns across this show, for a few clear reasons. First, the show presents Stewie's death within that simulation with complete seriousness in the moment it happens. There is no wink to the camera, no joke breaking the tension right as Peter pulls the trigger. For the audience watching in real time, without knowing yet that any of this was a simulation, Stewie's death plays exactly the same way any other permanent, dramatic death on the show might play, right up until the exact moment those 2 words appear on screen and change everything. Second, this storyline shows a different, more unusual method the show uses to handle the idea of death and return compared to everything covered earlier on this list. Brian's death and return worked through a real change to the show's own timeline, using a time machine the show had already built into its universe across earlier seasons. James James Woods' death and return worked through an absurd but still real in-universe medical explanation. Lois' death and return worked through an elaborate joke-filled backstory covering a full missing year, all before that whole storyline itself got revealed as fictional. Stewie's death and return work differently from all of these, existing entirely as fiction within fiction, a story built by a character inside the show, about events that never actually occurred anywhere within the show's real, ongoing history. Third, this particular storyline reveals something honest and direct about how Family Guy sometimes chooses to think about its own storytelling choices. By having Brian and Stewie openly discuss whether audiences might feel cheated by this kind of ending, the show admits, right there within its own dialogue, that twist endings built around a dream or a simulation carry a real risk of frustrating viewers who invested real attention and emotion into a story that turns out to have never truly happened. Rather than hiding from that risk, the show puts the criticism directly into the mouths of its own characters, using Brian to voice the exact complaint many viewers might have felt themselves, before using Stewie to defend the choice, and then undercutting that entire defense with one final joke about The Sopranos finale cutting to black in the middle of a sentence. There is also something worth pointing out about how this storyline reflects on Stewie as a character overall. Stewie has spent much of the show's history talking about wanting to kill his mother and take over the world, treated across many earlier episodes as a running joke that never actually goes anywhere serious. Building an entire simulation just to test out whether these long-standing goals would actually work, and then abandoning the plan the moment the simulation shows him it ends badly, including with his own death, fits perfectly with how the show usually treats Stewie's grand ambitions. He talks big, he plans elaborately, and when things do not go the way he wants, even inside a fictional test run of his own making, he simply decides to try again another day, with no lasting consequences carried forward into the real world of the show. This puts Stewie's death and return in an unusual position compared to everyone else covered on this list so far. It is not a real death undone through time travel like Brian's. It is not a real death explained away through an absurd medical joke like James Woods. It is not even a real death hidden behind an elaborate fake backstory like his own mother's turned out to be. It is, more accurately, a death that only ever existed inside a story a character told to himself, treated with full seriousness for a few tense seconds before the show pulls back the curtain and reveals none of it, including Stewie's own death, ever actually happened at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bertram never got the luxury of an entire simulation built specifically to test out whether his own death would go the way anyone wanted. His first brush with death happened for real, inside the actual ongoing world of the show, years before he was even fully born. Back when he existed as nothing more than a single sperm cell fighting for his life inside Peter's own body, and the story of how he survived that encounter, only to eventually meet a far more permanent end many years later, turns out to be one of the strangest journeys on this entire list. Section 8. Bertram. Apparent death, real return, and a later permanent end. Most characters on this list start their story as a fully grown person, already living their life in Quahog. Bertram is different. His story starts before he is even born, back when he exists as nothing more than a single sperm cell. And this strange starting point ends up shaping his entire relationship with Stewie for years to come. The story begins in an episode called Emission Impossible, which aired on November 8, 2001, as part of the show's third season. The episode opens with Peter and Lois helping deliver a baby for Lois's sister Carol, whose husband had recently left her. Seeing this whole process play out gives Peter and Lois the idea that they might want to have another baby of their own. Stewie, upon hearing his parents are considering this, is horrified. As the current baby of the family, Stewie has grown used to being the youngest, and the idea of a new sibling threatens the position he has built for himself inside the household. He decides he is going to do everything in his power to stop stop this from happening. After several failed attempts to sabotage his parents' plans through more ordinary means, Stewie takes things in an extreme direction. He builds a machine that allows him to shrink himself down to a microscopic size, small enough to travel inside his father Peter's own body. His goal, once inside, is simple and direct. He plans to destroy every single one of Peter's sperm cells before they get the chance to be used, stopping any possibility of a new sibling before it can even begin. Once inside, Stewie pilots a small ship through Peter's body, and the sperm cells around him are shown as tiny pilots flying their own small ships, matching the same visual joke used throughout this part of the episode. Stewie moves through this environment, destroying sperm cell after sperm cell with very little trouble, since none of them are able to put up any kind of real fight against him. Just as it looks like Stewie is going to succeed completely, he runs into one sperm cell that is different from all the others. This one does not go down easily. It fights back, showing the same kind of intelligence and cleverness Stewie prides himself on. This particular sperm cell will eventually be known as Bertram. The two of them fight for a while, but instead of Stewie simply finishing him off the way he did with every other sperm cell in Peter's body, something unexpected happens. Stewie and this one clever sperm cell start talking, and Stewie quickly realizes they actually have a lot in common. Both of them are intelligent. Both of them think of themselves as far smarter than anyone around them, and both of them are drawn toward big, dramatic plans. Stewie even considers, for a moment, that having someone like this around could actually be useful to him, someone he could work with toward his own goals, including his long-running interest in wanting to harm his mother, Lois. The two of them end their encounter on friendly terms, rather than as enemies, but Stewie is running out of time. His ship needs to shrink back to its normal size soon, and staying inside Peter's body any longer becomes dangerous. He barely manages to escape through one of Peter's tear ducts just in time, returning to his normal size with only seconds to spare. Back in the house, Lois has changed her mind about wanting a new baby after everything that happened with her sister, which horrifies Stewie all over again, since after everything he just went through inside his father's body, he now desperately wants his parents to actually go through with having another child, purely so that his new potential ally would have the chance to be born. He tries frantically to get his parents to change their minds back, but Peter ends up going to the bathroom by himself instead, using a magazine to finish what he originally set out to do without Lois involved at all. Stewie, watching this happen, believes for a moment that the sperm cell he had just bonded with, the one who would become Bertram, has been lost for good, along with every chance of him ever actually being born. Stewie appears genuinely upset about this, showing a rare moment of real disappointment rather than his usual scheming energy. Then, right at the very end of the episode, there is a small but important detail that changes everything. A brief moment shows a twinkle appearing in Peter's eye, a visual signal meant to let the audience know that at least one part of what just happened inside Peter's body managed to survive after all. This is the show's way of confirming, without spelling it out directly in words, that the sperm cell Stewie had just formed a bond with had, in fact, survived everything that happened, keeping alive the possibility that this character might return again someday. This moment technically counts as Bertram's first brush with death and survival on the show, even though he does not yet have a name, a body, or any kind of real identity, beyond being a single sperm cell at this point in the story. He faces what should have been certain destruction at Stewie's hands, along with every other sperm cell caught in that same encounter, and yet he manages to survive when almost nothing else around him did. Bertram does not actually get born or take on a real identity until years later in a season 4 episode called Sibling Rivalry, which aired on March 26, 2006. This episode picks up on a small detail from Mission Impossible that most viewers likely forgot about entirely in the years between the two episodes. Following a pregnancy scare, Lois convinces Peter to get a vasectomy, a medical procedure that would prevent him from from having any more children in the future. Worried they might eventually change their minds and want another child down the road, Peter decides to freeze some of his sperm ahead of time, just in case. While at the sperm bank getting this done, Peter, in typical clumsy fashion, accidentally knocks over and destroys a large number of existing sperm samples that had already been stored there by other people. Rather than admit what he has done, Peter quietly replaces the destroyed samples with his own sperm instead, hoping nobody will notice the difference. A lesbian couple visiting the sperm bank later ends up using one of these samples to have a child of their own, without realizing the sample actually came from Peter rather than whoever the original donor was supposed to be. 9 months later, this couple gives birth to a son, and that son is Bertram, now fully born and given a name for the first time, voiced by the actor Wallace Shawn. Bertram grows at an unusually fast pace within the show's own logic, reaching roughly the same age and size as Stewie within a fairly short amount of time after being born, which the show does not bother explaining in any realistic way, simply treating it as one more piece of cartoon logic audiences are expected to accept without question. Once old enough, Bertram starts showing up at the same playground Stewie frequents, and the two of them quickly find themselves locked in a battle for control over who gets to be the ruler of that playground. Their fight escalates in typically over-the-top Family Guy fashion. At one point, the two of them engage in an actual aerial battle, flying small fighter jets against each other and firing real weapons in a fight that causes far more destruction than two babies fighting over a playground would ever reasonably need. When that fight ends without a clear winner, Bertram switches tactics entirely, using biological warfare instead, by having Stewie's new girlfriend at the time infect him with chickenpox. Once Stewie recovers from being sick, he confronts Bertram directly, and the two of them settle their rivalry through a sword fight in the play area of the playground itself. Stewie eventually wins this fight, disarming Bertram and gaining the clear upper hand over him. Right as Bertram appears to be at Stewie's mercy, panicking and asking whether Stewie is actually going to kill him, the show cuts away to a different scene entirely. This next scene shows Stewie later that night, digging a large hole in the woods alongside a guest character from a completely different show, a mobster named Christopher Moltisanti, borrowed from The Sopranos for a quick cameo appearance. For a moment, this scene is clearly meant to make the audience believe Stewie has killed Bertram and is now burying his body out in the woods somewhere far from home. The joke reveals itself right afterward. Rather than digging a grave, Stewie and his guest companion are actually just planting a tree together, treating the entire dark setup as nothing more than a misdirection built purely for comedic effect. Stewie casually mentions that Bertram simply admitted defeat and ran off afterward, with no actual violence having taken place between them at all. This confirms that Bertram survived his second major encounter with Stewie, walking away from their playground rivalry alive, even if thoroughly beaten in their competition for control of the space. This wraps up Bertram's story for a long stretch of time, with the character not appearing again in any major way for several years after this episode aired. When he does eventually return, it comes in a season 9 episode called The Big Bang Theory, which aired in 2010. This episode brings Bertram back in a much darker and more serious role than anything he had been part of before, shifting his character away from a simple rival at the playground and turning him into someone attempting something far more dangerous and destructive. In this episode, Bertram gains access to time travel technology and decides to use it in an extreme way, traveling back in time specifically to kill Leonardo da Vinci, the famous historical artist and inventor from hundreds of years ago. Bertram's reasoning behind this plan connects directly back to his long-running rivalry with Stewie. By killing an ancestor far back in Stewie's family line, Bertram intends to erase Stewie's entire existence from history altogether, making sure Stewie would never actually be born in the first place, ending their rivalry permanently by making sure Stewie never had the chance to exist at all. Stewie tries to warn Bertram that killing someone this far back in time carries an enormous risk, potentially causing a paradox that could end up destroying the entire universe rather than simply erasing Stewie alone. Bertram, fully committed to his plan and clearly willing to accept any level of risk to finally defeat his longtime rival, decides to go through with killing Leonardo da Vinci anyway, accepting the possibility of destroying everything just for the chance to finally win. This decision leads directly into the final climactic battle between Stewie and Bertram, a fight far more serious in tone than their earlier playground rivalry had ever been. This time, there is no misdirection, no joke about digging a hole for a tree instead of a body. Stewie ultimately defeats Bertram for good in this fight, shooting him with a crossbow, first striking him in the chest and then finishing him off with a shot to the head. Unlike his earlier encounters with Stewie, where Bertram always managed to survive one way or another, this final confrontation ends with his death being treated as real and permanent within the ongoing world of the show. Bertram does not return again in any episode after this one. Looking at Bertram's full story from beginning to end, he stands out as one of the more unusual characters on this entire list because his story actually contains two very different kinds of near-death experiences separated by many years, followed by one final death that never gets reversed at all. His first brush with death happens in Mission Impossible, where he survives Stewie's attempt to wipe out every sperm cell inside Peter's body, confirmed alive through nothing more than a quick visual joke involving a twinkle in Peter's eye at the very end of the episode. His second brush with death happens years later in Sibling Rivalry, where a scene deliberately built to look like Stewie has killed and buried him turns out to be a misdirection, revealing Bertram had actually just surrendered and walked away from their fight unharmed. His third and final encounter with death happens in The Big Bang Theory, where he is shot with a crossbow after attempting to erase Stewie from existence entirely, and this time, unlike the two times before it, his death sticks for good. This pattern makes Bertram genuinely different from everyone else covered so far on this list. Brian died once, in a way the show treated seriously, and came back once, through a method built directly into the show's own established time travel rules. James Woods died once, treated seriously within the context of a major mystery episode, and came back once, through an absurd joke about celebrity medical treatment. Vern and Johnny died once, and continued existing afterward in some form of afterlife. Ernie died dozens of times across more than 2 decades before one final permanent ending. Kool-Aid Man died once, violently, and simply kept reappearing afterward with no explanation given at all. Lois and Stewie both appeared to die within a story that turned out to be a fictional simulation built by Stewie himself. Bertram, unlike any of these, survives 2 separate near-death situations across 2 very different points in the show's history, only to eventually die for real years later, in a way the show never walks back or reverses in any future episode. This also makes Bertram a useful example of how one single character can actually experience more than one kind of relationship with death across a long-running show. He is not simply a character who died once and came back, nor is he simply a character who died permanently without ever cheating death beforehand. He is both of these things at once, stacked across different points in his story, starting as a sperm cell who barely survived total destruction, growing into a child who faked his own apparent death as part of a joke, and finally ending his story as a genuine casualty of his own extreme plan to erase his rival from existence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not everyone on this list needed years of build-up, multiple close calls, or an actual crossbow to finally settle their story for good. Some characters on Family Guy managed to die and come back within the exact same episode, using nothing more than a well-placed cutaway gag borrowed directly from one of the biggest superhero movies ever made, disappearing into thin air for a joke that lasted only a few seconds before quietly, completely reappearing again, with absolutely no explanation given at all. Section 9. Cleveland Brown and Joe Swanson snapped out of existence by Thanos. Family Guy has always been a show built around borrowing from other pieces of pop culture. Movies, television shows, cameos, commercials, and famous real-world moments all show up constantly throughout its many seasons, usually twisted into some kind of joke that has little to do with the actual plot happening at the time. One of the clearest examples of this habit comes from an episode called Island Adventure, which aired as part of the show's 17th season in 2019. Buried inside this episode is a short scene that borrows directly from one of the biggest and most talked about movie moments of that entire year, and uses it to casually erase two of the show's longest-running characters from existence, only to bring them back with absolutely no explanation given at all. To understand why this scene works the way it does, it helps to know a little bit about what was happening in movies around the same time this episode came out. In 2018, a movie called Avengers: Infinity War was released, based on a large group of superhero characters owned by Marvel. Without spoiling too much detail about a movie unrelated to Family Guy itself, the short version is that the villain of that movie, a powerful being named Thanos, spends the entire story trying to collect 6 powerful objects called Infinity Stones. Once he gathers all 6, he gains the ability to erase exactly half of all life in the entire universe with a single snap of his fingers. Near the end of that movie, Thanos actually succeeds in doing this, and the film ends with a long, emotional sequence showing many well-known superhero characters slowly turning into dust and disappearing right in front of the audience, one after another, seemingly gone for good. This moment became one of the most talked about scenes in modern movie history, discussed everywhere, from major entertainment news sites to casual conversations among friends who had just watched the film together. Family Guy, always ready to reference whatever happened to be culturally relevant at the time, decided to build a small joke directly off the back of this famous movie scene. This joke shows up in the episode Island Adventure, specifically in a short scene involving Peter and his usual group of friends sitting around at the Drunken Clam, the local bar where they regularly meet up throughout the show to talk and drink together. During this scene, Peter brings up the fact that Thanos has recently gotten his hands on one of the Infinity Stones, referring to it specifically as the Mind Stone. Quagmire, one of Peter's friends sitting at the table with him, reacts to this news with concern, pointing out that this means Thanos now has every single stone he needs to complete his full collection. Quagmire then asks the obvious question that immediately comes to mind, given everything they just discussed, wondering out loud what this development might actually mean for the two of them personally. Peter has no real answer for this question, and it does not take long before the joke reveals itself completely. Shortly after Quagmire asks this question, Cleveland Brown, another one of Peter's close friends who has appeared regularly on the show since its earliest seasons, begins to fade away right there at the table, disappearing gradually the exact same way characters had been shown disappearing during that famous scene from the Marvel movie the year before. As this is happening to him, Cleveland looks over at Joe and makes a short comment acknowledging that he somehow already knew the two of them were going to be the ones affected by this, almost as if he understood ahead of time that out of the entire group sitting at that table, he and Joe were destined to be singled out for this particular joke. Joe, sitting right next to him, disappears in the exact same way just moments later, fading away completely until neither of them remain at the table at all. This entire moment plays out in a very short amount of time, lasting only a few seconds on screen, and it is treated with the same quick, casual energy the show usually brings to any of its smaller background jokes. There is no dramatic music building up to the moment, no long speech given by either character before disappearing, and no attempt by anyone else sitting at the table to stop what is happening or react with any real sense of alarm or panic. Peter simply watches it happen, clearly caught off guard by what he is witnessing, but the show does not linger on his reaction for very long before moving on to whatever comes next in the episode. According to reporting done around the time this episode aired, the show pushed this joke even further during its closing credits sequence, extending the reference well beyond just Cleveland and Joe disappearing at the bar. In that closing sequence, Thanos himself is shown sitting far off in outer space, appearing satisfied and pleased with what he has just accomplished. Rather than stopping with just these two characters from Family Guy, the joke expands outward to include other animated shows that air on the same television network as Family Guy itself, all of which fall under a shared branding, sometimes referred to as an animated lineup, airing together on the same night. Characters from these other shows, including The Simpsons, American Dad, Bob's Burgers, King of the Hill, and Futurama, are all shown being wiped away in the exact same manner, disappearing right alongside Cleveland and Joe as part of this same extended joke. Thanos is shown declaring, in an exaggerated villain-style speech clearly meant to sound over the top and ridiculous, that he plans to continue this pattern by erasing every single animated show on television, all so that nothing remains except low-quality reality television programs. A clear jab at that entire genre of television delivered through the mouth of one of the most famous movie villains audiences had recently seen on the big screen. What makes this whole sequence particularly interesting, especially for anyone specifically tracking characters who die and come back across the history of this show, comes down to exactly what happens after this scene ends. Cleveland Brown and Joe Swanson had both been part of Family Guy for many years by the point this episode aired, appearing regularly as two of Peter's closest friends throughout the entire run of the show up to that point. Cleveland had even starred in his own separate spin-off show for several years before eventually returning to Family Guy once that spin-off ended. Joe, meanwhile, had been part of the main cast since the very earliest seasons, known throughout the show's history as a police officer who happens to use a wheelchair, a detail the show frequently brings up in various ways across many different storylines involving his character. Given how long both of these characters had already been part of the show by this point, and given how many future episodes still needed them to continue appearing exactly as they always had, there was never any real possibility that either character would actually stay gone permanently because of this one joke scene. Sure enough, in every episode that aired after Island Adventure, both Cleveland and Joe simply continue appearing exactly as they always had before this moment ever happened. Neither character makes any reference back to having been erased from existence by Thanos. No other character in the show ever brings up the moment again either, treating it as though it never actually happened at all once the episode itself moves past that particular scene. This kind of treatment fits into a pattern that shows up again and again throughout the entire history of Family Guy, one that becomes especially clear once enough of these individual moments get examined side by side. The show frequently uses jokes involving death, disappearance, or serious harm purely as a quick way to reference something currently popular in movies, music, or the news, without any real intention of following up on that joke in any future episode. The entire purpose of the Thanos joke in Island Adventure begins and ends within that one single scene. It exists purely to make a quick, timely reference to a very famous movie moment that audiences watching at home would almost certainly recognize immediately, given how widely discussed and talked about that particular scene from Avengers: Infinity War had already become by the time this episode aired the following year. This particular example stands out from several others covered earlier on this list because of just how little weight or explanation the show gives to bringing these characters back afterward. Compare this to Brian's death, which stayed unresolved across multiple episodes and eventually required an entire storyline built around undoing it through time travel. Compare it also to James Woods, whose death received a full, if ridiculous, explanation covering exactly how he managed to survive being murdered. Compare it once more to Lois and and Stewie, whose deaths were eventually explained through the reveal of an entire computer simulation built specifically to explain away everything that had just happened. Cleveland and Joe receive none of this kind of treatment. There is no explanation given for how they returned. There is no scene addressing what happened to them after they disappeared. They are simply present again in the very next episode, exactly as if the entire moment involving Thanos had never taken place at all. This puts Cleveland and Joe's disappearance closer in style to some of the other examples covered earlier on this list, involving characters who die and casually reappear without any acknowledgement at all, such as the Kool-Aid Man's violent death and subsequent reappearances covered in an earlier section. Much like that example, the show treats this moment as something disposable, a joke built for one specific scene that never needs to connect to anything happening in any future episode. The difference here comes down to exactly how the joke gets built in the first place. The Kool-Aid Man's death happened as part of an actual ongoing storyline within a single episode, tied directly to a specific plot involving Stewie's evil clone going on a violent rampage. Cleveland and Joe's disappearance, by comparison, has nothing at all to do with any actual plot happening within Island Adventure itself. It exists purely as a standalone reference to a completely unrelated movie, dropped into the middle of an otherwise unconnected storyline purely because the joke itself would be immediately recognizable to anyone who had already seen that movie scene play out the year before. This raises an interesting point worth sitting with regarding how Family Guy chooses to use its own characters purely as vehicles for referencing other pieces of media. Cleveland and Joe, despite being two of the show's longest-running and most familiar characters, essentially serve as stand-ins for whichever random superhero characters happened to disappear during that scene from the actual Marvel movie. The joke does not actually require Cleveland and Joe specifically to be the ones disappearing. Almost any two characters sitting at that table could have been swapped into their place without changing the actual point of the reference in any meaningful way. This shows how these two characters, despite their long history on the show, get used here purely as a tool for delivering a timely cultural reference, rather than as characters whose specific personalities or history actually matter to the joke itself. Looking at this moment alongside everything else covered across this entire list, Cleveland and Joe's disappearance and return represents one of the clearest, simplest examples of how loosely Family Guy treats the entire concept of death and consequence. Whenever the show decides a joke calls for it, there is no build-up. There is no explanation. There is no acknowledgement given anywhere in any future episode that this moment ever happened at all. Two characters who had been part of the show for well over a decade at that point simply vanish for a few seconds, referencing one of the biggest movie moments of the previous year, and then reappear again completely unaffected, exactly as though nothing out of the ordinary had ever taken place. This example also helps highlight just how wide the range really is across this entire list when it comes to how seriously the show treats any individual death. On one end sits Brian, whose death carried real emotional weight, stayed unresolved for a genuine stretch of time, and required careful, deliberate storytelling to properly reverse. On the complete opposite end sits this moment involving Cleveland and Joe, a joke that lasts only a few seconds, exists purely to reference an unrelated movie, and gets resolved through nothing more than the simple fact that the next episode continues on as though the moment never happened in the first place. Everything else covered across this list falls somewhere between these two extremes. Whether that means Ernie's more than 2 decades of repeated fights and deaths, the Kool-Aid Man's one violent death followed by years of unexplained reappearances, or Bertram's strange journey through 2 separate near-death experiences before finally meeting a permanent end. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final example on this entire list takes this same casual, disposable approach to death even further, applying it not just to one or two side characters sitting at a bar, but to the entire main family all at once, wiping out every single member of the Griffin household in one quick, darkly comic moment tucked into the very final seconds of an episode, using nothing more dramatic than a set of missing batteries and a toy that happened to light up just a little too well. Section 10. The entire Griffin family wiped out by carbon monoxide. Every other example covered across this entire list involves one character, or at most two characters, dying and eventually coming back in some form. This final example goes much further than any of those, wiping out the entire main family all at once, treating the deaths of 6 separate people with less concern than the show usually gives to a single background character getting hurt in a random cutaway gag. This moment comes from an episode called Vatman and Rob M., which aired on April 23, 2023, as part of the show's 21st season. The actual plot of this episode has nothing to do with the ending it eventually delivers. Most of the story follows Peter getting a new job as a night watchman at the Pawtucket Brewery, the same brewery where he has worked on and off throughout the entire history of the show. Rather than simply doing his job the normal way, Peter decides to use his position to secretly open an after-hours bar inside the brewery itself, bringing in his usual group of friends to help him run it once the building is officially closed for the night. This turns into its own small storyline involving illegal drinking, customers sneaking in late at night, and the kind of chaotic situations that tend to follow whenever Peter decides to bend the rules for his own benefit. Running alongside this main plot is a separate, smaller storyline involving Stewie and Brian. In this second story, the two of them come across a missing dog flyer while out on a walk together, offering a reward of $1,000 to anyone who can help bring the missing dog home safely. Noticing that this missing dog looks remarkably similar to Brian himself, Stewie comes up with a plan. He decides the two of them should try to trick the dog's owner into believing Brian is actually the missing pet, purely so they can collect the reward money for themselves without needing to do any real work to earn it. This plan quickly goes wrong. The owner of the missing dog turns out to be a man named Chase, someone who has built a large following online by posting videos of himself performing dangerous stunts with different dogs, seemingly with no real concern for their safety. Once Chase gets his hands on Brian, believing him to be his missing pet, he wastes no time putting him directly into another one of these dangerous stunts, this time involving Brian being tied to a remote-controlled drone flying dangerously close to the ocean, all set up specifically to promote a company that makes a certain kind of personal lubricant product. Stewie, realizing what kind of danger Brian has actually been placed in, works together with Chris to track them down and stop the stunt before Brian gets seriously hurt. After a chaotic rescue involving the drone crashing and both Brian and Stewie ending up safely landing in a small pool filled with the very product this whole stunt was originally meant to advertise, the smaller storyline wraps up with everyone safe and unharmed. None of this has anything to do with what happens in the final moments of the episode. Right at the very end, after both of these separate storylines have already wrapped up on their own, the show delivers what is often referred to as a stinger, meaning a short extra scene placed after the main story has already concluded, typically used to deliver one final joke before the episode officially ends. This particular stinger completely changes the tone of everything that came before it, even though it lasts for only a few seconds. In this closing scene, Peter is shown speaking directly through narration, explaining something to the audience that has nothing to do with anything shown earlier in the episode. He reveals that at some point, without any of this being shown on screen or connected to anything happening in in the main plot, he had removed the batteries from the household's carbon monoxide detector, a safety device specifically designed to alert a family if dangerous, invisible gas starts building up inside their home. Rather than needing these batteries for any kind of emergency or safety-related reason, Peter took them purely so he could use them to power a toy instead, specifically a light-up visor connected to a Star Wars theme park attraction, treating this small piece of entertainment as more important than keeping his family's safety device fully functional. As a direct result of this decision, carbon monoxide, an invisible and highly dangerous gas, is able to build up inside the house completely undetected. Since the detector meant to warn the family about exactly this kind of danger no longer has any working batteries inside it. Peter reveals, still speaking through this same closing narration, that this buildup of gas ends up killing the entire family. Every single member of the Griffin household is affected, including Peter himself, along with Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian, all of them dying together inside their own home without ever realizing what was happening to them. Peter even adds one additional grim detail to this closing narration, mentioning specifically that it was Joe, his close friend and neighbor, who eventually discovered all of their bodies after the fact, presumably after noticing something was wrong once nobody in the family had been seen or heard from in some time. The scene itself briefly shows the family's bodies as part of this closing joke, confirming visually that this is not simply something Peter is describing without it actually happening, but rather something the show fully commits to showing, even if only for a few short seconds before the episode ends completely. What makes this particular moment stand out, even compared to some of the other quick, casual deaths already covered earlier on this list, comes down to just how much this specific ending goes against the basic setup of a normal episode. Throughout the entire runtime of Vatman and Rob-M, nothing about either storyline, whether that involves Peter's illegal bar or Stewie and Brian's scheme involving the missing dog reward, gives any hint that the episode is building toward an ending this dark or this final. There is no warning sign planted earlier in the story, no small detail about a broken smoke detector mentioned anywhere before this closing scene suddenly reveals it. The entire twist depends completely on catching the audience off guard, delivering an ending that has absolutely nothing to do with anything the episode had actually been building toward throughout its main runtime. This kind of structure fits into a specific pattern that shows up in different forms throughout the history of Family Guy, sometimes referred to informally as a sudden downer ending, meaning an ending that takes an otherwise lighthearted or unrelated story and closes it out with something unexpectedly dark or serious, typically played for laughs rather than any kind of genuine emotional impact. The entire joke here depends on just how extreme and sudden this shift feels compared to everything that came before it. An episode spent mostly on a silly storyline involving an illegal after-hours bar and an even sillier storyline involving a missing dog scam suddenly ends with the complete and total death of every single member of the main family, delivered through calm, matter-of-fact narration rather than any kind of dramatic build-up or reaction from the characters themselves. According to how this specific ending has been described and discussed afterward, this entire sequence gets treated using a specific storytelling idea, sometimes called negative continuity, meaning a style of storytelling where events from one episode are not expected to carry over or affect anything that happens in future episodes, allowing a show to reset itself completely, no matter what happened previously. This particular ending gets specifically pointed out as a clear example of this idea in action, since the show fully commits to showing the entire family dying together inside their own home, only for this event to be completely undone and forgotten about by the time the very next episode begins airing, with the family shown alive, well, and going about their normal lives exactly as they always always had before this moment ever happened. This puts the ending of Vatman and Rob M in an interesting position when compared to everything else covered across this entire list. Unlike Brian's death, which stayed unresolved for multiple episodes before eventually being reversed through an actual, carefully built storyline involving time travel, the deaths of the entire Griffin family here get undone through nothing more than the simple passage of time between one episode ending and the next one beginning. There is no explanation given anywhere for how the family managed to survive this. There is no scene showing anyone getting revived or rescued. The show simply moves forward as though this moment never took place at all, treating the entire family's death as a joke meant purely for this one specific episode's closing seconds, rather than anything that needs to actually connect to whatever story comes next. This also connects back to a pattern already covered earlier on this list involving Cleveland and Joe's disappearance during the Thanos joke in Island Adventure. Both of these moments use a sudden, unexplained death purely as a quick joke, resolved entirely through the simple fact that neither moment ever gets brought up again in any future episode. The difference here comes down to scale, where the Thanos joke affected only two side characters for a few seconds during one scene in the middle of an episode. This ending affects every single member of the main family at once, and it does so specifically as the final image the audience is left with right before the episode cuts to its closing credits, giving the joke slightly more weight purely because of how completely it wipes out the show's entire central cast in one single moment. Looking at this ending alongside every other example covered across this entire list, it becomes clear just how differently Family Guy is willing to treat the idea of death depending purely on whatever specific joke a given episode happens to need in that moment. Some deaths, like Brian's, get built up carefully across multiple episodes, treated with real emotional weight, and resolved through methods the show had already established within its own internal rules. Other deaths, like the ones covered involving Vern and Johnny, Ernie, the Kool-Aid Man, Cleveland, and Joe, and now the entire Griffin family all at once, get treated as nothing more than a quick, disposable joke, given no explanation and no lasting weight beyond the specific scene or episode where they happen to occur. This final example arguably represents the most extreme version of this pattern out of everything covered across this entire list. It is one thing for a single side character to die and casually reappear without explanation. It is another thing entirely for the show to be willing to kill off its own core family, the 6 characters the entire series has been built around since its very first episode aired back in January of 1999, purely to deliver one quick, darkly funny final joke before an otherwise unrelated episode comes to a close. The fact that the show is willing to go this far, wiping out its own central cast without a second thought, purely for the sake of a single closing gag, says something important about just how little permanent weight death actually carries within the world Family Guy has built for itself over more than 2 decades on the air. Taken together, everything covered across this entire list paints a fairly clear picture of how this particular show has always approached the idea of death and return. A small handful of characters, most notably Brian, and to a lesser extent Lois, get treated with real, genuine care. Their deaths built up with actual emotional weight and resolved through methods the show takes seriously within its own internal logic. Everyone else, whether that means a pair of forgotten stage performers, a giant chicken fought over the course of more than 2 decades, a talking pitcher of juice, a sperm cell turned rival turned permanent casualty, 2 side characters erased by a movie villain, or an entire family wiped out by a badly maintained smoke detector, gets treated as nothing more than a tool for delivering whatever specific joke a given episode happens to call for in that moment, brought back with little or no explanation the very next time the show needs them standing there again, exactly as if nothing had ever happened to them at all. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.